It's recording. So Bryant is here. Curry is online. Well, Bryant is here with WBSU gear. Curry is online. Darby is also wearing state gear. Fisher is online. Hamilton is online. Hellman is online. Ashley's here. In-state gear. Miller is online. Well, Crystal's online. Taylor is here. Chase is here. In-state gear. Rollins is not here and not online. Saunders is not here and not online. Shamblin is not here, not online. Vargas is here in person. All right. And it's 8 o'clock. Let's get started. So the big announcement, of course, even if you forget it, you should be okay, but we are not going to be in this classroom on Friday. We're going to be in that classroom right across the hallway. So 203. If you forget, that's okay. There'll be signs. First of all, there'll be a bunch of people in here you don't recognize. Then there'll be a little sign on the board that says, hey, if you're in 511, we're meeting in 203. Any questions about that? And again, for this lab this week, it is virtual. It's on the computer, so make sure you bring your computer to the lab. If I can get around to grading it before it's time to come to lab, then you don't need to come to lab. Some of you already have done it and know that you don't need to come to lab. I guess that's it for that. Speaking of bringing computers and speaking of the first announcement, if you can, I would bring your computers when we meet on Friday. If you come in on Friday, again, I wouldn't blame you if you didn't since we're starting fall break. Anyway, if you do come in on Friday, if you do meet in H203, bring your computers if you can, just in case. You know, I've had issues with technology, so let's be prepared for us going there and the projector not working or the computer not working, whatever it is. That way I can just whip out my computer and we can still do the discussion, the lecture, except you'll be looking at the screen from there instead of from the projector. So any questions about anything? All right, before we go to the next chapter, I kind of wanted to do a better job of wrapping this chapter up, this last chapter, chapter 19. So even though I mentioned these things during the lecture, I wanted to come back and put it all in one spot. So this is at the end of the PowerPoint for chapter 19. This is stuff that was in the new textbook that I didn't necessarily discuss much because it wasn't necessarily on the PowerPoint. So let's talk about the things that are in the chapter 19 textbook, but not in the chapter 19 slide that we just concluded, right? That's what we're talking about. Part one. The first thing, so basically what I'm telling you is stuff you don't need to know. So you don't need to necessarily take notes. What I'm telling you is like when you get to this stuff in the book, you can say, oh yeah, I don't need to know that. So the first thing that you'll see is the specifics about estimated population size. Remember I was talking about how it is not really possible to usually get the population size. It is with humans, but for other things it's not, right? So your book got specific. It talked about things like quadrants and marking and recapturing. And then they even had an equation, which was the number marked first catch times the number marked on the second catch, divided by the number marked on the second catch, right? So you can forget about all that stuff. When you're reading the textbook and you're learning about estimating population size, you can ignore all that stuff. They also talk about species distribution patterns. That's other stuff you can ignore. That won't be on the exam. Part two, demography. Basically, what we were talking about is demography, but demography sort of like focuses a little bit more on the human population. But anyway, you don't need to know anything about the word demography. All the stuff we talked about basically falls under that category. There's an equation for the mortality rate. You don't need to know that equation. Let me do attendance words. Sorry, guys. The first word for attendance, I guess, will be mortality. Anyway, yeah. So any of these equations that you'll find in chapter 19, you don't know, but you don't need to know. So again, mortality rate equation, the population growth rate equation, right? You can see this is what it looks like for regular population. That's different. One of them is logistic population growth rate, and the other is exponential growth rate. Either way, you need to know those concepts because we talked about them, but you do not need to know the equations. So remember, we also talked about density-dependent factors and density-independent factors, and I think I mentioned this during the lecture, but I want to make sure I point it out now. Your book doesn't call them factors, it calls them density-dependent regulation and density-independent regulation, right? So instead of the word factors, your book uses the word regulation. Same concepts, different way of writing it. Any questions so far? All right, some more stuff. Here's a long list. So this is a list of things that were included in chapter 19 on your textbook. That were not included on the PowerPoint. You do need to know these. But here's the thing. In the old textbook, the one that I'm teaching out of, all this stuff is the stuff that's in chapter 20. So we're going to learn about this stuff in the next PowerPoint. So when you're studying it from your textbook, again, it's coming from chapter 19, not chapter 20, but the PowerPoints that will come from chapter 20. Not that it matters, right? It doesn't matter what chapter it came from. These are just things that you're going to need to know, and then hopefully we're going to jump into today when we jump into chapter 20. So any questions about this so far? All right, some other stuff. Again, these are things that were not covered in the chapter 19 PowerPoint, but they will be covered in the chapter 20 PowerPoint. So all the stuff will be in the chapter 20 PowerPoint, except this one, foundation species. So we're not going to talk about that at all. You don't need to know about it. Yeah, and all this other stuff, again, these are things that if you were to read chapter 19 from your old textbook, you'd be like, wait, why didn't we cover that? But we're about to. It's just that in the old textbook, they belong to chapter 20, and I happen to agree. Because what we just finished, chapter 19, is all about a population. And remember, population is all about a group of one species, right? A group of organisms of the same species. And all this stuff, this is ecology stuff. This is community stuff. So it doesn't actually belong in this chapter. And that's it for that chapter. So does anybody have any questions about chapter 19 before we jump into chapter 20? All right. Well, if you look at the, we can't really see it here, but if you look online, the WPSU online, you'll see that there's a chapter 20 and a chapter 21. Probably what I'm going to do is just talk about chapter 20, because all the things that you need to know from your textbook from chapter 21 will be included in this chapter 20 PowerPoint. So as far as we're concerned, this is probably going to be our last chapter. I'll give you more specifics as we get a little bit closer to the end. All right, let me download it and then open it up. So are there any questions while I'm making this download? All right, download it. Let's take a look. Okay, and again, to remind you, the last chapter was all about population. Population is a group of individuals of the same species that are at the same place at the same time. Right? They're dealing with the same factors, right? They're competing for the same food, competing for the same water, competing for the same places to hide, whatever it may be that population needs. They're competing for all the same stuff. They're dealing with the same climate, dealing with the same predators, dealing with the same diseases, all that stuff, right? That's a population. Now what we're about to do is bring it up a notch, so to speak. We're getting a little bit higher. Now we're about to start talking about communities and ecosystems. Well, you see what that is as we get there. Here we go. Let's talk about it. This is really important. The first thing we're going to talk about is biodiversity. Then we'll talk about community ecology. And again, the community is a step up from a population, and you'll see why when we get there. Then we'll talk about ecosystem ecology. And again, ecosystem is a step up from a community, which is a step up from a population. That all makes sense when we get there. The first thing we need to talk about is biodiversity. If you've had Bio 108, you understand how important this concept is. First of all, what is biodiversity? Does anybody know what biodiversity is? All right, forget biology for a second. If you were looking at going to a grad school and they said something like, you're reading their website and they say, well, we want to diversify our student body. What do they mean by diversify our student body? I mean, they want like, well, what do you think? What do you think that means when they say, when you're looking at admissions and seeing what your chances are of getting in that school? What do you think they mean when they say they want to diversify their student body? Or if you're looking to get hired at a place because you're about to graduate and they say, well, we want to diversify our workforce. What do you think that means by diversify? You're different, yeah, but how?
Variety.
Yeah.
A variety.
A variety, right? Like maybe different ages, different ethnicities, make sure maybe half and half for the sexes, maybe different religions, whatever it may be, right? They want a variety of different people, right? Coming from different backgrounds. Well, if you think about variety, that's the same thing here for biodiversity. So, we're not looking at religion or sex or, where you come from and things like that. But you do need to know what biodiversity is. The most simple concept or definition is this. It is the variety of living things. So memorize that first. The variety of living things. It gets a little bit more deep than that, but first memorize that before we get to talk about the details. So, as far as you can see, anyway, the biodiversity in this room is very small, right? They're very little. Because as far as I can see, looking, the only living things in this room are us humans, right? That's the only species I see. Granted, there's a lot of bacteria inside of us, and you guys have mites living in your skin. There's probably a little bit of mold in the air, definitely bacteria all over everything. So it's actually a pretty diverse area, but as far as we can look and see, it's just humans, not very diverse. So yes, memorize that, the variety of living things. Here's where it gets a little bit trickier. We're going to talk about all these separately. There's subcategories of this. There's genetic diversity, there's species diversity, and then there's ecosystem diversity. And again, we're going to talk about all these separately. So there's no need to write that down yet. So for the exam, I might ask you the definition of biodiversity. And then I'll probably describe some situation. I'm like, all right, here's the biodiversity of this group, right? And I'm going to describe one of these three things. And you need to recognize it as, oh, he's describing genetic diversity, or he's describing species diversity, or he's describing ecosystem diversity. So again, when you get there, keep that in mind. That's how the test is going to go. Me giving you a hypothetical situation, and you recognizing it as one of these three. All right. First one we're going to talk about is genetic diversity, which is good because in a sense we've already talked about it. And that's not necessarily in this context, but we have talked about genetics, so this concept is not new. And remember when we were talking about populations, and we were talking about evolution. One of the types of evolution we talked about was the bottleneck effect. And we used cheetahs as an example, so here we are, we're going back to this. Genetic diversity in a population, it's the variation in alleles, right? So again, just because it's easy and we have familiarity with it. What was it? Having a chin dimple is dominant. Okay. So imagine if everybody in this room had a smooth chin. That means we're all homozygous recessive, right? We all have the same allele. Now imagine for some reason, I don't know, everybody in West Virginia had a smooth chin. So they're all homozygous recessive. That's not a lot of genetic diversity, right? We all have that small allele, right? But if we had more people, and maybe if it was 50-50, dominant allele versus recessive allele. And that's just talking about one trait. Obviously, when we're talking about variations in alleles, we're talking about the whole gene pool. So you need to definitely understand what the genetic diversity of the population is basically, how do you put it? What's the layman terms for it that you hear all the time? And they say, oh, they don't have a very deep gene pool. That's what they mean, right? So that's a lack of diversity. So when they say they have a deep gene pool, that would say, there is a lot of genetic diversity. As you know, these variations in allele, these mutations is where they start, first of all. That is the raw material that makes microevolution and adaptation possible. So we need genetic diversity, right? Not just us, but all these species need genetic diversity because it helps them stay alive. So how do we lose genetic diversity? Well, basically, if you lose individuals, right? So for every individual you lose, right, you're going to lose a little bit of genetic diversity. Whatever they added to the gene pool, you lose a lot of it. And this isn't trivial. The reason this is important, not necessarily for the exam, but why this matters to the rest of us. Oops. That's weird. It's not working. Anyway, the reason it's more important to the rest of us is right there. It's the genetic resources for that species decline. So you guys remember, actually, have any of you had COVID? Not that you have to answer because it's a HIPAA thing, but I've had COVID. She's had COVID. So we, at least two of us in this room have had COVID. Obviously, we didn't die. Here we are, right? How many of you, how many of you know somebody who died from COVID? I do too. Okay, so only two of us. But surely you've heard of people that died, right? The point being, we survived COVID. Some people didn't. And there's a lot of reasons why, but let's just focus on this and make it simple. Let's assume that there's a genetic reason for that, right? There's something in our genes that made us not as susceptible to COVID. And there's something in those people who died, there's something in their genes that made them more susceptible to COVID. Now, if something happened and we lost all the individuals that had genomes like us, where we're saying we're immune to COVID, and everybody on Earth was a lot like those people who died, COVID would have been a lot worse, right? Because there's not a lot of genetic diversity in the human population in that hypothetical situation. So in that situation, COVID, instead of killing some people like it did in real life, it would kill nearly everybody if that was the situation, if we didn't have any genetic diversity. That make sense? All right, well, let's give you a real life example. Well, first of all, there's the cheetahs. Like I said, we use that discussion, or use them as an example of the discussion for bottleneck. And they don't have a lot of diversity. And again, before I move to the next example, another hypothetical example, if there was some disease that came out and if it could wipe out one cheetah, if there's a disease that could wipe out one cheetah, some new disease, it could probably wipe out all of them, because they're not very different genetically. Anyway, let's talk about a real life example. And something called bioprospecting, right? So when we're talking about genetic diversity, it does have economic value. So again, this isn't just an academic discussion. This is also a discussion about money. Bioprospecting is looking for the potential development of new medicines, industrial chemicals, other products, all this stuff, looking at genetic diversity. Again, there's money to be made from it. And also, very importantly, it can save our food supply. So this is the real life example. And this is from your old textbook. I need to remind myself if it's in your new textbook. But as usual, since it's just an example, you don't need to memorize it. I would put an X through here, but it's not letting me. For some reason, that stopped working. But anyway, an example. Cavendish bananas. Well, first of all, when you go to the store, nearly every time you go to the store, that's the kind of banana you're going to see, right? It's not like apples. When you go, there's Honeycrisp and there's, Fuji and Granny Smith, all these different varieties of apples at Kroger, right, or whatever store. When you go to the store, they're almost entirely Cavendish bananas. That's because almost all the other ones have been wiped out. They've been killed. And also for whatever other reasons. This is just the breed that you usually get at the store. But here's how the Cavendish bananas are interesting. They're all a clone, basically. So they're not really bred traditionally. They're all essentially a clone of each other. There is literally no genetic diversity. So if there is a pathogen or a disease that could wipe out one banana tree, it could potentially wipe out all the banana trees because they have no genetic diversity. And again, this isn't hypothetical because one has emerged. Right? So there's some places on Earth where they've pretty much lost all their banana crops because, again, there was this pathogen. They're all genetically identical. Therefore, this pathogen just wiped them out. So what they're looking for, going back to this bioprospecting idea, is they're looking at other varieties of bananas, like the varieties that are out in the wild, the varieties you don't see at Kroger, right? They're looking at their genomes and trying to see how those genes are different than these genes. They're going to see if they can genetically modify them, right? Bring some of those other genes in, add some diversity to the Cavendish bananas so they're not so likely to disappear. Any questions about genetic diversity? That's it for genetic diversity. So again, in the exam, I'll probably give you some example where I'm describing genetic diversity. You need to recognize it as genetic diversity as opposed to species or ecosystem diversity. Speaking of species diversity, here we go. Let's talk about that now. When most people think of biodiversity, I think that's what they're thinking of, species diversity. So basically, species diversity is what it sounds like. It's just the number of species in a given area. So again, in this room, at least by looking, it's very low species diversity because there's only humans in here that we can see, right? So that's what species diversity is. And your book, or at least your old textbook, really makes a good point talking about this. We are pushing species towards extinction. And at the present rate, right, the present rate of extinction is 100 times higher than any time in the past 100,000 years. If I could draw on the screen, I put it next to that. Not that it's not important. That is an important thing, but you know me, I don't usually ask you about numbers like that, this time included. And at the current rate, over 1/2 of all plant and animal species may be gone by the end of the century. So again, this is just kind of like an introduction into what we're going to talk about and explaining why it's important. But I'm not going to ask you those specific numbers. And again, like I mentioned the last time we talked, this is important, not just for tree hugging stuff like, oh, save the whales and hug the trees. It's not just that stuff. This is important for our survival. As you're going to learn towards the end of this course, we're getting there. We need all the pieces of the ecosystem for the ecosystem to function. And we need ecosystems to function for us to survive. So this isn't just about like, want to make sure that the coral reefs look pretty so we can go scuba diving and enjoy it. That has a lot to do with it too, but it's not just that, right? We need all these ecosystems for survival. And the ecosystems need all these species for survival. Anyway, here's an example from your last textbook. There's this thing's called Hector's dolphins. They've gone extinct. That's just an example. You don't need to know anything about that. Same here. I love this example because when the old textbook was published, somebody had declared these things extinct. The Formosan clouded leopard. But since then, since 2016, that's actually come out that they're not extinct. Somebody has found some. So that's one of the things I love about nature. It's not set in stone, right? It's static. But anyway, again, just an example. You don't need to know it. Here's some non-book examples, at least from your last textbook. I chose them. The West African black rhinoceros is now extinct. That's happened since I started teaching this course. That's why I included it. It was a more recent example of an extinction. And then I chose passenger pigeon and Carolina parakeet because those are closer to here, right? Passenger pigeons are extinct. Carolina parakeets are extinct. And those are things that you would have found in this area a long time ago. But again, those are just examples. I'm not going to ask any questions about that. Any questions about that? All right. Here's some more numbers that you don't need to know. This is from your old textbook. Also, your old textbook is indeed old, so these numbers are probably a little bit different. But at the time, there was about 13% of the 10,004 bird species were endangered. About a quarter of the 5,488 mammal species are endangered or threatened with extinction. Over 20% of the freshwater fish have become extinct during human history, or at least seriously threatened, right? So not just like the number of fish in total, but the number of species. We're starting to wipe them off the face of the earth. About 41% of the amphibians are threatened with extinction, and of the about 20,000 U.S. plant species, 200 of them have become extinct since humans have been here. So that's pretty big. And about over 10,000 plants worldwide are now threatened with extinction. Point is, not a good thing. And again, just to remind you, it's not just a matter of being kind to the environment, saying we want to save these species. And I do, just for the sake I think they deserve to live, just for the sake of being alive. But also, on a more pragmatic note, we need the different species for the ecosystems to work, and without the ecosystems working, we won't survive. So it is a matter of survival. Again, I'm not telling you we're going to all be dead in 5 years if we don't save the hummingbirds. I'm not saying that, but it is a matter of life and death eventually. Ecosystem diversity. First of all, you need to know what an ecosystem is. So let's talk about that. An ecosystem includes the organism or all the organisms and the abiotic factors in a particular area. So again, using the same example I've been using for a while now. All the squirrels on WVSU's campus, that's a population, right? That's a group of the same species in the same area, blah, blah, blah. Now, if you also include all the other living things on WVSU's campus, like the feral cats that chase the squirrels, and the oak trees where the squirrels get their food, and the humans that the squirrels try to avoid, right? All the other living things, including the squirrels, that's called a community. And a step up from that is an ecosystem. So yeah, we're still looking at all those living things, but then we're also looking at the abiotic factors, which are the non-living factors. So, anyway, so things like climate, for example, or not always climate. Like for example, Wallace is a big tall building, right? It casts a big shadow. I bet if you were to look carefully, the grass that grows on one side of Wallace is probably different than the grass that grows on the other side of Wallace. some of it. Because there's some species that require more sun and some species that require less sun, right? And that's an abiotic factor. The shade that building casts is an abiotic factor. I would assume, again, if we're going to talk about squirrels, I would assume the squirrels probably hang out on that side of the campus more than they do this side of the campus, probably, because there's a lot of traffic noise coming from this side of the campus. That is an abiotic factor, right? They hear the noise, they stay away from it. Anyway, so does anybody have any questions what an ecosystem is? All right, so due to the interactions of many different species, the loss of one species can have a negative effect on the entire ecosystem. So that's what I was saying earlier. So this is kind of a good segue, because we're still talking about species diversity a little bit, right? We need species diversity for ecosystems to function. However, again, let's move forward. Well, actually, let's talk about this a little bit more here. This is what I was getting at earlier, and now it's in writing. Remember I was saying we need ecosystems because it is a matter of survival? Well, this is where we're getting at. You know this word? Ecosystem services. These are functions that are performed by an ecosystem that directly or indirectly benefit people, right? So for some of the stuff, it's trivial, but for some of the stuff, it's life and death. Like the air that we breathe, right? Water purification to an extent, even though we do have water treatment plants. Climate regulation, erosion control, stuff like that. And these are just the things, again, what are some other examples? So for example, all the pollinators, right? When people grow crops, they don't need to go out and pollinate each plant by hand because there's insects that do that, right? That is an ecosystem service. Without those insects pollinating the plants, we would starve, right? Because we need them for our food. But then there's other things that we really don't have time to get into too much. But for example, sometimes it's not necessarily about survival. Sometimes it's about money. So think about how much money the New River Gorge area brings in. And they're coming in, even though they don't think this in their heads. They're not like, I'm going to go see those ecosystems. But they are, right? They want to see the natural beauty of West Virginia and go whitewater rafting and go hiking and do all that stuff. And that's all possible because of these different ecosystems. And the different ecosystems are all possible because of all the different species in them. Anyway, any questions about this? Your old textbook used coral reefs as an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about this, but coral reefs, I think that is a good example. And again, that's good. I grew up in the South, and I actually grew up in the Keys for a little bit. So our economy was based on coral reefs. Right? People coming to fish and people coming to scuba dive and snorkel. That was it in Key Largo. Nobody else was coming, for the most part, for anything else. There's no beaches to speak of. There's no water parks. Like, they were coming for the coral reefs. So the same way West Virginia is dependent on coal, Key Largo is dependent on coral reefs. But anyway, coral reefs are rich in species diversity, yet about 20% of them have been destroyed by humans, of 20% of the coral reefs so far. And 75% are threatened, and that's expected to top 90% by 2030 if the current abuses continue. And this is true, again, coming from Key Largo, I've seen this firsthand. When I was a kid, I used to go snorkeling. It looked amazing, and now when I go back, it looks like just death. Anyway, what this book, your book didn't get into too much before I move forward. Again, we're talking about ecosystem diversity. So first of all, we need the species diversity in the ecosystems for them to work. But then we also just need all the different ecosystems around. We need a bunch of different ecosystems for them to provide the ecosystem services. Anyway, any questions about ecosystem diversity? All right. Let's talk about causes of declining biodiversity. It's four main factors. You don't necessarily need to write them down yet because we're going to talk about them all individually, but you do need to know them. The four main factors for the causes of declining biodiversity are habitat destruction and fragmentation, invasive species, which we've already talked about, so we're going to come back to it, overpopulation, and pollution. And basically what it all boils down to is this bullet point right here, the expanding size and dominance of the human population, right? That explains the population, the pollution. That explains the overexploitation. That explains the invasive species. That explains the habitat destruction and fragmentation, right? It all comes down to us. Now, granted, things do naturally go extinct. That's a natural cycle, but humans have exacerbated the problem. There we go. The first one we're talking about is habitat destruction. One main thing you need to know about habitat destruction more than anything else is it is the greatest threat to biodiversity. So of all the other four we talked about, that's the number one, and that will almost definitely be a test question. And that should make sense too, because when you think about it, kind of the other stuff leads into this. Pollution was one of the other four, right? Well, pollution leads to habitat destruction. Over exploitation, right? Over harvesting. That leads to habitat destruction. Invasive species was the other one, and again, it leads to habitat destruction. So it should be easy for you to remember, is all the other three lead to habitat destruction. Anyway, where does this habitat destruction and fragmentation come from? Well, there's a lot of stuff, but some of the textbooks examples include agriculture, urban development, forestry, and mining, right? So here's a picture of mining. So that's in West Virginia, mountaintop removal. That has destroyed that habitat in that particular area. Urban development. Humans need a place to live, right? Agriculture, human needs food. Forestry, right? Again, humans need to live, right? So they need lumber to build their houses. Well, that's where forestry comes in. So anyway, yeah, that's the biggest problem. What's I gonna say? Yeah, so really quickly, for example, agriculture, that's one of the reasons why organic farming is considered pretty bad for the environment. Well, for a lot of reasons, but in the context of this conversation, organic farming is a lot less effective than conventional farming. So if you have 1 acre of land and you're doing conventional farming, you might put up, I don't know, let's just call it a ton. And this is really a big exaggeration, but just to keep the numbers easy. 1 acre of land gives you a ton in traditional farming. But if you do organic farming, it might be the same acre would give you half a ton. Again, I'm making the numbers up. The point is, organic farming is actually generally speaking, pretty bad for the environment. Anyway, any questions about what habitat destruction is? All right, the next thing we'll talk about, but we've talked about it before, so we're going to through it pretty quickly, is invasive species. You already know what they are, right? We talked about this in the last chapter. But what you didn't know, because I didn't mention that then, is that is the second greatest threat to biodiversity. So make sure you know that invasive species are the second greatest threat to biodiversity. As you already know, because we already had this discussion, they compete with native species, right? So maybe they compete for space, maybe they compete for food, maybe they compete for water, whatever it is, they compete with native species. Sometimes they also prey upon native species. Asian carps are a good example of that. And sometimes they parasitize native species. In other words, in one way or the other, these invasive species are bad for the native species. We've already had long discussions and gave a lot of examples of how that works. So are there any other questions about invasive species? All right, the next one's pretty common sense here. Over-exploitation. That's just like harvesting too much. That's all that is. That's like catching fish quicker than they're replenished, for example. Cutting down trees. Maybe you cut down trees and you plant new ones, but maybe you're cutting them down quicker than they can be replenished. That is over-exploitation. So excessive commercial harvesting, poaching, and sport hunting have greatly affected populations of, these are just examples, you don't need to know these examples, but tigers are endangered, American bison, Galapagos tortoises, there's a long list. And sometimes it's for food, like sometimes it's for sport, like it says here. Sometimes it's just because you want to bring these animals somewhere and sell them. So, for example, parrots are not on this list, but parrots are a good example of that. They're endangered in the wild because people keep taking them to sell them as pets. But also, and I like to throw a book through this out there, sometimes it's also trees too. Like mahogany and rosewood, they're very expensive woods because they're very rare trees, relatively rare trees. So because of that, they're getting overexploited. So again, what you need to know about overexploitation is this first bullet point here. It's usually from harvesting at rates that exceed the ability of a population's ability, or the ability of the population to rebound. Pretty simple stuff, right? All right. Any questions about that? The next thing we're going to talk about, and the next word for attendance, is pollution. And this is really simple, at least it could get complicated, but in this course, considering it's only one bullet point, it's pretty simple. Air and water pollution are a contributing factor in declining populations of many species, right? So the global water cycle transports pollutants from terrestrial to aquatic ecosystems thousands or hundreds of miles away. This is true, right? So if my neighbor were to be, I don't know, changing his oil and washing his car and just dumping it on the ground, washing it all off, all that stuff, because I'm not too far from the Kanawha River, is going to wash down into the Kanawha River. And then from there, it's going to go to the Ohio River. And from there, it's going to go to the Mississippi River. And from there, it'll go to the Gulf of Mexico, right? Here we are, hundreds of miles away from the Gulf of Mexico, but we can still pollute it, right? My neighbor, or I guess I could too if I did it, but I wouldn't do that. I actually need to go with my neighbor. Anyway, point is, even though we're way over here, we can still pollute the Gulf of Mexico, which, by the way, goes into the Atlantic Ocean. So eventually we make its way there too. Also, pollutants in the atmosphere are carried for thousands of miles. And your old textbook points out that they can also fall as acid precipitation. But that's just one of the problems. It's not just always acid rain or acid snow. For example, going back to the Florida stuff I was talking about, our economy in Florida is mostly based on tourism. So what's happened, not just from West Virginia, but all these other places too, including West Virginia, that burn coal, even though they're scrubbers, and the scrubbers get most of the pollutants out of the smoke, doesn't get all of them, right? So we get mercury in the atmosphere in West Virginia, and then it floats away and goes somewhere else, and then it lands in the Everglades, and that mercury is then incorporated into the ecosystem, and it's killing a lot of the species down there. So here we are, our economy is doing good because we're burning our coal, and that's what we do, and that's good for our economy. But then it's going down there, and it's killing wildlife, which is making the Everglades basically killing them slowly, and that's bad for the Florida economy. So it's interesting when you talk about the environment and the economy. In many ways, it's usually one, the economy is doing good when it's hurting the environment, but then somewhere else, another economy is doing bad because of the harm to the environment. And as you guys watched the polluted, yeah, you guys watched that. So really quickly before I move forward, the polluted waters video you guys watched, right? So the crabbing industry was being hurt by the poultry industry, right? So right there, even in the same spot, you have one industry doing great financially, but it was hurting the environment. And then another industry in the same area was doing horrible because the other one was doing good and had fewer regulations. Anyway, any questions about this slide? Long story short, pollution's bad for biodiversity. That brings us to the second main bullet point. Yeah, we can at least get this started. So all this stuff I showed you on that last bullet point for chapter 19, I said, all right, these are things that were not listed on the chapter 19 PowerPoint, but they are on the chapter 19 book. And the chapter 19 of the textbook. This is it. Now we're getting back to that stuff, except again, I'm presenting it in the chapter 20 PowerPoint. First thing you need to know was what a community is, and I've already talked about this. A community is a step up from a population. It is the assemblage of species, of all the species, living close enough together for potential interaction. So again, it's a step up from a population. A population is a group of individuals of the same species interacting with each other, right? Now, we're not just looking at the same species, we're considering all the species. So are there any questions about what a community is before we talk a little bit more about it? Here's a slide from your old textbook. It's a great example. And so we can see a lot of different species, and we also, you probably do know the interactions between them, right? So the zebra eats the grass, the lion eats the zebra, but also has to compete with the hyenas and the vultures who also eat the zebra. They're scavengers, right? So these are more, the lion's more of a predator. Those are more of scavengers. All these things, when they eat, they're going to poop. That's going to fertilize the grass, right? And then again, it goes back to the zebra eating them. All of them, when they die, are going to get decomposed, and that's going to go back into the grass. So all these different interactions. And that's just what we see, right? We don't even see all the different types of grass. To me, that looks like the same, but I'm sure it's not. And all the little insects that live in there, right? There's a lot of things we don't see. All the parasites living in and on those larger animals. Anyway, here we go. Let's talk about interspecific interactions. This is the stuff that, again, was on chapter 19 in the textbook, but not on the chapter 19 PowerPoint. Interspecific interactions. First of all, you need to know what an interspecific interaction is before we start talking about all the different ones. You can't really see that picture, but that's a picture of I-64 from where it starts to where it ends, because I-64 is interstate, and interstate brings you between states, right, between different states. Well, hopefully that helps you remember what interspecific interactions are. Those are interactions between species. So two squirrels competing, see, like trying to harvest acorns from the same tree as quick as they can. That is not interspecific, right? Because those two squirrels are the same species competing for each other. But, like that picture I just showed you, the lion trying to eat that zebra before the hyenas do and the vultures do, that's an interspecific interaction, right? Those are different species interacting with each other. So make sure you understand that definition before we move forward. Because all these interactions are classified according to the effect on the populations concerned. And that's what you're going to need to know after this. So you're going to need to know, is this mutualism? Is this parasitism? Is this commensalism? All these things I'm about to teach you. But again, the first thing you need to understand is what interspecific interactions are. And that is interactions between species, right? Different species interacting. Any questions about this slide? All right. The classifications of interspecific interactions, which we're going to talk about in more detail later, are basically classified as this. And there's no need to write this down, because even though they are basically classified as this, we're going to get more specific for the exam. But basically speaking, it's either negative, right? It's bad for both populations. It's positive, or it's good for both populations. Or it's positive, negative, right? Which is it's good for one and bad for the other. And again, you don't need to know that. That's too broad. We're going to get more specific. So let's just go ahead and jump into it. First one we're going to talk about is interspecific competition. And that's simply the competition between species. And this results in population growths that are limited by the population densities of competing species, right? So in that case, generally speaking, maybe like the more of your population there are, the better, because you're competing against a different species. So yeah, pretty simple stuff, right? Competition between species. So again, in that picture I showed you earlier, the lions and the hyenas, right, those are competing. That would be interspecific competition, because they're competing for that same food source. Excuse me. And again, like I said, they're all categories based. This one happens to be negative. Not that I'm going to ask you that. So any questions about this slide before we talk a little bit more about this? What determines the populations will compete? And that's something called an ecological niche, or niche, depending on who says it. Either one's correct. And you need to know what this is. It's a word you need to know. That is an organism's total use of the biotic and abiotic resources. In a sense, you could almost think of it as an ecological job, right? It's what they do, right? So a plant, well, first I use this. No, I won't use this yet. So if you're talking about the ecological niche of a certain species of plant, you're like, well, okay, you're talking about what it needs. So it needs a pH of this in the soil. It needs, temperatures from here to here. It needs this much sunlight per day. It prefers this humidity. It prefers to get this much rainfall. It's all the very specific stuff that it requires for it to do its job in the ecosystem. Or for a fish, how much salt, if it's a brackish water, or I don't want to get that detailed. Yeah, so if we're talking about a fish in the ocean, does it like shallow water or does it like deep water? Does it like cold water or does it like warm water? Things like that. But anyway, your old textbook gives these example of barnacles. I'm not gonna read through this. I'll just show you the picture. These are just an example. You don't need to know it. But these barnacles have similar niches, right? They require similar things. They require, rock and water. Sometimes they can be in the water. Sometimes they can be out of the water. Some of them do a better job of being out of the water, right? In this case, this browner colored genus. They're both competing for space, right? They're both competing for area on this rock. But it just so happens that the blue ones don't do as good being out of the water as the brown ones, right? So what happens is over time, they're competing, but the brown ones win. For whatever reason, the brown ones are better. But, that's what happens. Anyway, what your other textbook said, and obviously you don't have the other textbooks, you can't read it. What happened is, this was an experiment that was done. This is what it looked like, right? So some scientists went out here, there was a genus, this browner genus was up top here, the blue genus was down here. So one might guess, again, pretend like you don't see that picture, one might guess that this genus can't live way down here, but that's not the case. What was happening is they were competing with each other. Once you remove this blue one, then this one was able to take advantage of the whole area. Because again, what was keeping this one here and these up here is because they were in competition. Anyway, that's just one example. You don't need to know it for the exam. But that does bring us to a concept you do need to know for the exam, and it is called the competitive exclusion principle, which states if two species have an ecological niche that is too similar, they cannot coexist in the same place. So what I just showed you was an example of that. Those barnacles did not exist in the same place. There was the blue ones down low and the brown ones up top. And then again, experimentally, they showed if you got rid of the blue ones, the brown ones took over. So they do. Because of competition, they exclude each other. And I'll give you these examples of parameciums. Again, just examples, you don't need to know for the exam. You probably might not even know what a paramecium is. They're little single-celled organisms. So they're good to study because you can just keep them on a little petri dish. And that's what someone did here. So here we have two different species of parameciums, right? They're in the same genus, not that that matters. But when they grew them separately, like here's a dish with this species, here's a dish with this species, and they tracked the population size, you can see for both of them, it was very similar. Both of the populations kind of grew at the same rate. They kind of hit the same carrying capacity, even hit it around the same time, right? This is when they were growing separately. Now, once you put them in the same petri dish, then because their niches are too similar, they compete. And usually when they compete, one wins and one doesn't. And that's exactly what happened here, right? The red one outcompeted the blue one. That population exploded. Well, it didn't explode. But it went up, not as high as it did when it was alone, but it went up. And the other population, the blue one, just went down and pretty much went extinct. So that is, back it up again for you, the competitive exclusion principle. And another thing, and your book doesn't get into it too much, but this is another reason why biodiversity is so important. Because, like for example, a predator would keep this from happening. In a real life situation, this blue one would start expanding. Like let's assume this is an insect. These are two different species of insects, right? If this one starts getting really large and you're a bird that eats insects, you're going to eat more of the red one than the blue one just because there's more numbers. So then eventually the red one would dip down and the blue one would come up. And then you're the bird eating, right? So now there's more blue ones, so you start eating the blue ones, right? So this would just kind of cycle because we have the predator to help keep things even, right? That helps ensure that the species who's like really competing and doing a great job are also going to get kept in check. And then the species that was declining can also then get a chance to come back up. Anyway, any questions about the competitive exclusion principle? So when we come back, we'll talk about mutualism. And mutualism will be the last word for attendance. And again, we're going to meet on Friday in that room. It's the last day before fall break, so I completely understand if you just attend online. If I were you and had the chance, I would be traveling as soon as I was done with my last class. But I don't have that chance, so I will be here.
So if you're done with the lab, you don't have to come to this.